Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Samini.
Welcome, Vice President.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate Stephen's generous introduction, and and I appreciate what you and your colleagues do, Samini. I don't want to run the risk of sounding like a flatterer, but the Times coverage has really been dedicated and outstanding. I really appreciate it. You're performing a great service.
We appreciate our readers and subscribers. Now, you need no introduction, Vice President Gore.
You forgot your advertisers.
Well, our subscribers are extremely important.
Okay, yeah, they're very good. All right, good. Sorry.
You were the subject of the documentary An Inconvenient Truth, of course, in 2006. One thing that I learned recently was that you have trained since then. Lots and lots of climate activists all around the world. You've spent 16 years training climate activists. That is one thing that I actually learned only recently. You've spent years warning us of the problem. You told us a story of our collective future that we needed to heed. It is now impossible to ignore, right, as we've seen. Now that we know, what do we do? Is it time for a different kinds of stories now? You speak of positive tipping points. Tell us a little bit about that. What are positive tipping points? Why are those important stories now to tell?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, you're correct. The Climate Reality Project is an NGO that I founded with all of the profits from the movie back in 2006, and we have trained approximately 50,000 activists in 3.5 day long training sessions on the causes, the solutions. We give them advocacy skills. We just completed our 50th training. 7,200 people signed up in Brazil 6 weeks before the election there, the first round of which starts next week. I'm hoping that turns out well. We had one in Queensland in Australia. Several of the trainees ran for the Australian Parliament, got elected, and the government, a lot of Australian groups played the key role, but the government flipped, and then 2 weeks ago, Australia just passed historic climate legislation that mirrors the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. So we continue to do this. It's based on the theory that the policy-making apparatus in too many countries has been captured and controlled by the fossil fuel industry and by other major industries. And so a bottom-up push from the grassroots is actually a key part of what's needed. I think that in the main, that is beginning to take effect. The legislation in both Australia and the U.S., and soon after, you know, if the election goes well in Brazil, they will change also. The European Union seems to be finding the right balance between short-term measures to deal with the cutoff of fossil fuels from Russia and an acceleration of the long-term transition, because obviously their national security interests are threatened by Russia's attempt at blackmail. And they, as one of their ministers in Germany said, renewable energy is freedom energy. And here's an important positive tipping point to keep in mind on the horizon. If and when we reach true net zero, temperatures on Earth will stop going up with a lag time of as little as 3 to 5 years. So it really is as if we, humanity, have a switch we can throw. If we just obey the first law of holes, when you're in one, stop digging. If we can get to net zero, and if we stay at true net zero, astonishingly, half of all the human-caused greenhouse gas emissions will fall out of the atmosphere in as little as 25 to 30 years. So we can solve this, but it is getting steadily worse. This is not what the physicists call a random walk. It gets steadily worse every single year. We've had 12 once-in-a-thousand-year downpours in the U.S. in the last 12 years. You're not supposed to have a once-in-a-thousand-year event twice a year. We've had 5 in the last 7 months. So it's getting worse, much worse, more quickly. So it's a race right now between the solutions and the political actions necessary to implement these solutions on the one hand, and this dangerous worsening of the climate crisis. And one other point, there are negative tipping points, of course.
Of course.
You know,
yes.
the chance that the frozen soils of the Arctic North will start releasing methane uncontrollably. The Gulf Stream could be disrupted further, et cetera. There are about 14 of them. We have to win this race to implement solutions before we cross one of those negative tipping points.
As you highlight the work of people who are really working to keep our home from frying, is there one kind of thing that really excites you?
Well, what excites me is the enthusiasm and the determination of these young people of all ages who go through these training programs. And the second training program I did was in my home city of Nashville. Christiana Figueres was one of those who went through that program. And I could cite examples all over the world of women and men who have gone through this, who have then run for office. They've become environment ministers. They've been ministers of other sorts. A lot of people have gone through it and changed their lives in the business world. We have a lot of terrific business leaders who are providing leadership. Andrew Forrest from Australia is here in the audience today. There's so many others who have dedicated their professional lives to making the world a better place as they earn profits for their shareholders. And it is possible to do both. Now that we are in the midst of this sustainability revolution, where renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuel energy, electric vehicles within another year or two, within 3 years, all model categories will be cheaper than internal combustion vehicles. Battery storage and other energy storage is getting much more affordable. Regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, the circular economy. We're already seeing green hydrogen and green ammonia made with renewable energy to supply very high temperatures for industrial processes without fossil fuels. We have everything we need to solve this crisis, save political will.
Let's talk about that.
But political will is itself a renewable resource. The whole name of the game is to renew the resource of political will.
Let's talk about that. We know elections matter. The U.S. election brought this country back into the Paris Agreement and the first climate law. You've spoken of the Australian election. Which one are you watching very closely? Which other election tipping point do you think is really going to matter between now and 2030?
Well, Brazil. Brazil has been by far the worst deforesting nation in the world. Most of it is criminal, against the law, corrupt. Of course, the key challenge is not just the outcome of the vote. Former President Lula is way ahead in the polls, but the current president of Brazil has been openly saying that he might invite the military to play a role, and that's quite concerning. I can't believe that Brazil would allow the condemnation of the world community if their president took that step, but you know we have to guard against that. So that's the election that I'm focused on right now. And of course, the elections for the House and Senate here in the United States of America today is National Voter Registration Day. When people ask me, what can I do? Well, you can start by registering to vote and voting and taking other people to the polls. It's dangerous and concerning. It's quite concerning the degree to which big money has achieved an influence over the making of policy in the U.S. It's really a national scandal. And the threshold for changing that is higher than it should be, but it can still be crossed. And if people turn out and vote in large numbers and make what many of us regard as the right choice, then this momentum can be accelerated. And I'm very optimistic that will occur. But that's what I'm focused on right now.
Well, you know, the climate crisis is happening alongside the rise of authoritarian leaders across the world. So I'm genuinely puzzled by this. Can authoritarianism tackle the climate crisis in some way? Is democracy a necessary ingredient of climate action in the world? How do you reconcile these two things happening at the same time?
I think democracy is a prerequisite for climate action. And if you look at the history of the 20th century, in some ways it was all about the testing of alternatives to democratic capitalism on the left and the right, fascism and communism. And those systems failed, and they were characterized by the worst assaults on the integrity of the environment in history. And autocracy and authoritarian governments have historically been devastating to the environment. When governments are genuinely democratic, they are much more likely to be responsive to the desires of people to have clean air and clean water and green spaces and a clean environment and a hopeful future. So yes, I think that's necessary. But let me draw another connection here, because I think that some of the causes of the climate crisis are also causes of this wave of authoritarianism. We have seen the rise of hyper inequality. The richest 1% of the world now controls 46% of the world's wealth. And the rise of any economic inequality of incomes and net worth is true not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And the appeal of the former U.S. president is partly due to the fact that for 40 years and more, the majority of the middle class has had no real increase in wages. Meanwhile, they're treated in the media to this meteoric rise in the wealth of the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, and it's a bit much. And people are saying, well, this is not working for me. And that increases the appeal of the authoritarian strongman approach to making extravagant promises, usually allied with the same wealthy elites and usually corrupt. So I think that these have gone together. And one of the underlying causes is that we have not had an accurate measurement in our economy of what's most valuable to us. We look through a very narrow aperture of short-term profits for one stakeholder, the shareholders, when now there is a big shift toward a philosophy that business must look after their employees, the communities where they live, the environment where they operate, the distant communities in their supply chains, the distribution of incomes and net worths. We need to have multi-stakeholder capitalism that focuses the purpose of business not just on narrow short-term profit, but long-term well-being that includes the interests of other stakeholders.
What are the prospects of U.S.-China cooperation on climate right now? And do you see evidence that China is genuinely interested in playing a role?
Yes, I do. But when you asked earlier about what election I'm looking at, the election from the Party Congress is not a classic election, but Xi Jinping is attempting to get a third term and, in effect, a lifetime appointment. And I think when that is over with, and I think we can probably predict the outcome, maybe he will feel more flexibility to resume the dialogue with President Biden. They're scheduled to meet in Indonesia at the G20 after the Party Congress outcome will, I think, represent a change. Xi Jinping, the principal policy guy for Xi Jinping,
for climate.
On climate, yes, Really wonderful. So China's, there's bad news and there's good news. They're building more coal plants than the rest of the world put together, but they're building and installing more solar and more wind than the rest of the world put together, more high-speed transmission lines, more smart trains, more smart buildings. They're really doing all. If you look at the investment in the sustainability transition, China is doing by far the most of any nation in the world. So
if it were a race, would China be winning the green economy race right now?
No, because they're still doubling down on fossil fuels, and their goal is for 2060, which is far too far away. My experience with China is that they plan their work and then they work their plan, and I do think they will work this plan, but the plan needs to be much more ambitious. And by the way, they have many reasons for doing this. You mentioned, or somebody mentioned in the opening, the heat wave in China this summer. Let me just pause a moment on that. For 70 days, the temperature above 104 degrees, as high as 113 degrees, over a vast area of China. The historians of climate-related extreme events say there is nothing even minimally comparable in world history to this heat wave in China. Now virtually the entire country is in drought. Agricultural harvests have been damaged, and they have simultaneously had these massive rain bombs or downpours, another fingerprint of the climate crisis, and their economy has been devastated by it. And since it continues to get worse each year, there's a point at which they have to say, wow, we have got to really accelerate this change dramatically and cut down on fossil fuels quickly. And now that it's cheaper to do so than to continue with fossil fuels, I'm hoping that they will make this shift.
The U.S. has a climate law.
Yeah. At long last.
At long last, with quite a bit of money behind it. What does the U.S. administration have to show now, have to show the rest of the world now, in order to demonstrate that the United States is a reliable partner? Because as you know, there is lingering distrust about the United States' ability to keep its word.
Well, first of all, the rest of us have to step up. I mentioned, did I mention there's an election coming up in November? I think that's super important. But where the administration is concerned, I'm so thrilled with what President Biden has done, with what Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin did in the Senate, with what Nancy Pelosi and her team did at the House. And let me mention, there are about a dozen U.S. Democratic senators who have made themselves true experts on this. They have dug in. And if you go back to the initial proposal by President Biden at the beginning of his term, the Build Back Better, the giant package, so many parts of that have been stripped out over time, and all of them have had a haircut, a cut in money. The least haircut of all has been in the climate provisions, because these Democratic senators stood guard and fought every step of the way. So it won't implement itself. Now the task of implementing this historic law, and it's a terrific law. I mean, not only the money, $369 billion, but the structure of it, the tax credits, where a lot of the heavy lifting is done, are 10-year tax credits. That really is good for the private sector getting the right signal. I've already seen lots of businesses make major shifts in response to the passage of this law. But we have to make other changes. We need to get a new head of the World Bank, for God's sake. This is ridiculous to have a climate denier as the head of the World Bank. And here's why that's important. And the U.S. has that position. They have to get votes from other shareholders. But for what we're doing in the U.S., which is great, it's not the same in developing countries. If you're in Nigeria and you want to privately finance a new solar farm, very profitable, you have to pay an interest rate 7 times higher than what the OECD countries pay. If you want to build a wind farm in Brazil, you have to pay interest 3 times higher than what the U.S. pays. So since almost 90% of the increased emissions going forward are coming from developing countries, we have to take the top layers of risk off the access to capital in these developing countries. That's the job of the World Bank, to coordinate the other multilateral development banks, and they're simply not doing it. We need to get rid of that leadership, put new leadership in, and I hope President Biden will take that initiative.
We will hear from the World Bank president later.
Good. Tell him I said hello. Tell him I said goodbye.
Since we're on the topic of finance, I want to ask you about something that is really a fault line in these negotiations, and that's the issue of loss and damage. Across town, just this morning, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, made a call for a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies in rich countries, and for that to be rediverted to loss and damage financing. The U.S. has long been against creating a separate mechanism, and it's really been the most contentious issue for some time, and it promises to be the most contentious issue on the table at COP27. What's your position on loss and damage? Should the U.S. be more flexible on this?
Well, first of all, I just mentioned the access to capital in developing countries. The economic attractiveness of this sustainability revolution. We're in the early stages of a sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. And if you look at, and private capital has to finance it. If you look at all the, last year, by the way, worldwide, if you look at all the new electricity generation installed in every country, 90% of it was renewable, almost all of it solar and wind. 86% of it was financed in the private sector. So this continued focus on government-to-government funding, what my constituents when I was in the Congress used to call foreign aid, is difficult to pass in wealthy countries at a time when globalization has been centrifugally flinging jobs to low-wage venues, and now some people say, oh, you want to send our tax money there too? I'm for it, okay? I support
You think a loss and damage financing mechanism is?
I think,
but
it's
quite
not,
different
but let's be realistic about it, is what I'm saying. The funding that is needed in these developing countries is going to come mostly from the private sector. Should there be more government-to-government aid? Of course, I've long been for it. But let's be realistic about it. Same thing with, you talk about windfall profits tax. The new government in the UK just rejected that. I've long advocated a carbon tax. I got one passed by the House of Representatives in the first Clinton-Gore budget, and then the Senate defeated it, a familiar script. We should have a global carbon tax and finance this transition, including compensation for some of the damage. More importantly, adaptation. More importantly still, financing the clean energy transition and the sustainability revolution. But let's be realistic. The prospects politically for a carbon tax are de minimis. And so we've seen all these efforts to have a workaround, and the economists love it. But as the old joke in the advertising industry has it, they came up with this fantastic ad campaign for dog food, and they deployed it, and the sales went down, and the answer after much investigation was the dogs don't like it. And the voters don't like a carbon tax, and so let's be realistic about it.
Which was the approach, of course, of the new climate law. It was a workaround against
it was, but it's important to add also, there is a methane tax in this law. Now the fossil fuel industry is trying to remove it and repeal it, but we did get a methane tax passed as part of this law.
Baked into this. So I want to open up the floor to questions, please. There will be mics around the room, and first question over here, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Renata Koch Avarenga. I'm a gender and climate, I'm right here. Gender and climate justice activist from Brazil. I know you mentioned a lot about Brazil, and also part of the Generation Climate cohort of the New York Times. So bringing a lot of the youth work to these conversations. So we know that the United States is one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we also know that the countries that are most affected by climate change are the ones that are least responsible for causing it, right? So we have talked about the importance of mitigation, a little bit about loss and damage, but I wanted to ask about adaptation and climate justice more specifically. So in my own country, in Brazil, you mentioned President Bolsonaro. He's speaking almost simultaneously to this panel in the General Assembly Hall at the United Nations. And we know that in local communities in Brazil, they're fighting against deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, unprecedented heat waves, and human rights violations against environmental defenders. So given this very challenging scenario, my question is, how do you perceive the role of the United States in supporting and investing in adaptation mechanisms when we know that the countries need the most do not have the financial means or the resources to do that themselves?
Obrigado. It's great to see you, Renata. Thank you for going through the climate training back in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, this has to be a worldwide response to this crisis. And it should include adaptation funding as well as the financing for the transition to renewable energy and electric vehicles and the other solutions that I mentioned. And the U.S., in my opinion, is still the only nation that can rally the global community to make this global effort. But I'm hoping that former President Lula will be successful in your election starting next week, and that he will join this effort as well. But obrigado.
De nada. Let's see some hands in different parts of the room. How about over here, one, and then second over here.
Hi, Jim Hurd, Green Science Exchange, San Francisco and Washington, D.C. Do you feel that after the midterms it would be wise for President Biden to declare a national emergency on climate?
Well, thank you for the question. I've kind of ducked that question in the past, and I'll tell you why. I think that it would create the impression that it does more than it really does. I mean, Mother Nature has already declared an emergency, and there may be a few advantages that might come from that, but it would give people the impression, okay, we have climate martial law or something, you know, and it wouldn't do anything of the sort, and I wouldn't be in favor of that anyway. So I've been a little bit of a skeptic on the declaration of an emergency. It sounds like a great solution. If you dig down into the details, it doesn't really do that much. But I'll tell you,
You just answered the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I tried not to.
Thanks for the question.
You backed me into a corner. Go ahead.
There was a hand up here, please. Sure.
Harriet Lamb from Climate Solutions charity Ashton. And I wanted to ask you about COP27 with the whole trust deficit opening up between, in particular, developed and developing countries, and what more you think we can do to put the needs of all those millions of people, particularly in Africa, who still have no access to any energy at all, how much we can really put the focus on them having access to renewable energy so that we're powering up renewables as much as, particularly to people in the last mile, as much as we're powering down fossil fuels? Yeah,
great question, thank you. And I'm looking forward to being in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I know you're going to be there with your team, Samini. It's not a pledging conference, but it's still like Glasgow or Paris 5 years before Glasgow, but it is a very significant conference, and this issue of access to capital for developing countries is going to be key. I mentioned previously the unequal access to private capital because of the way our international financial system operates. That has to be fixed. But I want to add one point. Most of the new fossil fuel infrastructure in developing countries particularly is built by state-owned enterprises. And they don't have the same problem of access to capital. The government there guarantees it. And in some countries, hate to say, it won't be shocking to you, there's a lot of corruption involved in these projects. And so there is a dynamic where it's much easier to put pipelines in the ground and oil and gas wells in the ground than it is to build the cheaper, cleaner, better sources of energy, solar and wind. And we have to fix the structural problems that bias these choices toward more and more fossil fuels. If you look at government subsidies of fossil fuels, from 2020 to 2021, government subsidies of fossil fuels doubled worldwide, doubled. Now, forcing taxpayers around the world to subsidize the destruction of human civilization is not a clever policy. And really, that's the low-hanging fruit. We ought to deal with that immediately.
The newsletter today actually is devoted to the question of gas projects in Africa. Who gets to burn gas in the future? What should that be for? So you'll be interested in seeing that.
And let me make one point on there. There is this mythology that gas is cleaner than coal. There are two mathematical facts to keep in mind. One is when you burn gas, you release only half the CO2 per BTU, per amount of energy created, compared to coal, 2/3 compared to oil. So that makes gas sound better. But molecule for molecule, each molecule of methane, which is what gas is, natural gas, a marketing slogan from 100 years ago, each molecule of methane is more than 80 times more powerful in trapping heat than each molecule of CO2. So if you have 2 or 3% leak, then it's worse than coal. And more than 2 or 3% leaks. And the Climate Trace Project will come out next month, and we'll have for the first accurate measurements of where all these emissions are coming from. And it's a shocking story how big a problem methane is. So it's not a cleaner fuel. It's not a bridge to a greener future. It's the classic bridge to nowhere.
A very patient hand over here, please, in the second row. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, first, thank you so much. My name is Eduarda Zogby, and like Renata, I'm a climate activist from Brazil, and I'm very thankful that you're mentioning Brazilian elections. And I will say, Mr. Al Gore, you've changed my life. I was 12 when I watched your Inconvenient Truth. And like many other youth activists, we listened to your words, and we're doing everything that we are today because we really believe in it. So as you may know, most of us suffer a lot from climate anxiety, and we're very worried about what's going to happen to our generation and our kids and our grandchildren. So my question to you is there a message of hope? And after, an Inconvenient Truth, how do you see today a climate perspective for young people like myself?
Oh, thank you so much. Your words mean so much to me. And the answer to your question is yes. The antidote to climate anxiety is climate activism. And don't give up hope. I mean, this is a challenge for all of humanity. We have a lot of weaknesses in our nature, but we also have the capacity to rise above our limitations, and we have done so at critical moments in the past. This is the most critical moment in the history of humanity. A scientist told me 40 years ago, Al, what's really at stake here is the question of whether or not the combination of an opposable thumb and the neocortex is a viable combination on planet Earth. Really and truly, we have to answer the question, who are we? Are we capable of looking into our own future and making wise choices to express the love and care for our children and future generations that we feel in our hearts, and then actualize that care and concern with sensible choices. Now that the choices are better in other ways anyway, cleaner, cheaper, produce 3 times as many jobs, dollar for dollar, what's not to like? Harry Truman once said, as president, he said, I spend 95% of my time trying to convince people what they damn well ought to be doing in their own self-interest anyway. That's where we are globally, where these solutions are concerned. Now, is there a legitimate basis for hope? Yes, look back at the history of all the morally based movements: abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, the civil rights movement in this country, anti-apartheid in South Africa, more recently the LGBTQ revolution. If somebody had told me that in the year 2020, in a decade or two ago, that gay marriage would be legal and celebrated by the vast majority of people in every state, I would have said, I hope so, but that's not likely. It happened because, as with all of these morally based movements, once the underbrush is cleared away and the central choice is revealed as a choice between what is right and what is wrong, then the outcome is foreordained. The polluters that have been profiting from this have been trying to confuse people, and they've lied on an industrial scale with billions of dollars, and hopefully we're leaving that era, but they need to be called to account. But the central point is the central choice is now being revealed as a choice between right and wrong. We're going to win this. We are going to prevail. Political will, as I said, is a renewable resource. The remaining question is whether we will win it in time before we cross some of these dangerous negative tipping points. I'm very optimistic that we are going to do it, but it needs all of us to put our shoulders to the wheel. And did I mention there's an election coming up? Thank you.
I'm going to walk away from this session with the 2 words, care and concern. I think that's a really wonderful note to end. Vice President Al Gore,
Oh, thank you.
I thank you. Off to our next session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you very much.